The conference room at NATO headquarters in Brussels buzzed with the familiar sounds of military officials settling into their seats. Maps covered the walls, satellite images spread across tables, and the air carried the weight of serious decisions waiting to be made. Lieutenant Sarah Chun adjusted her uniform one final time before stepping through the heavy oak doors. At 28, Sarah was the youngest intelligence analyst ever invited to brief the Joint Strategic Planning Committee. Her slight frame and quiet demeanor often led people to underestimate her, something she had grown accustomed to throughout her military career. Today, however, felt different. The stakes were higher, and the room was filled with some of the most powerful military minds in the world. As she entered, conversations gradually died down. Eyes turned toward her, some curious, others skeptical. She recognized several faces from military publications and news reports. Generals who had commanded troops in multiple theaters of war, admirals who had navigated complex naval operations, and intelligence chiefs who had prevented countless threats from reaching the public eye. "Gentlemen," announced General Morrison, the committee chairman, "this is Lieutenant Chun from the Defense Intelligence Agency. She has some findings regarding the situation in Eastern Europe that require our immediate attention." Sarah noticed how several officers exchanged glances. She had seen those looks before during her time at the Pentagon and in various military installations around the world. The expression that said, "What could someone so young possibly teach us?" It was a look that questioned not just her age, but her ability to understand the complexities of modern warfare and international relations. Colonel Hartwell, a decorated veteran with silver hair and a chest full of ribbons, leaned back in his chair with barely concealed amusement. "Another fresh face from analysis," he whispered to the officer beside him, just loud enough for Sarah to hear. "I wonder what groundbreaking discovery she thinks she's made from behind a computer screen." Sarah had spent 3 years in field intelligence before moving to analysis. She had walked through war zones, interviewed refugees, and gathered intelligence in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. But she knew that her appearance and age would always invite assumptions about her experience and capabilities. Setting her briefing materials on the podium, Sarah looked out at the assembled group. 37 military leaders from 19 different countries, each carrying decades of experience and the weight of national security on their shoulders. The pressure was immense, but she had prepared for this moment for months. "Thank you, General Morrison," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "Over the past 6 months, my team has been monitoring unusual military movements along the eastern border. What we've discovered challenges our current understanding of the threat level in that region." She clicked the remote, and the first slide appeared on the large screen behind her. Satellite images showed troop movements, supply convoys, and infrastructure changes that had occurred over recent weeks. The images were crisp and detailed, clearly showing a pattern that had previously gone unnoticed. Admiral Thompson, known for his direct approach to military matters, interrupted before she could continue. "Lieutenant, we've all seen these satellite feeds. Our intelligence departments review them daily. What exactly do you think you found that our experienced analysts have missed?" The question carried an edge of impatience and skepticism. Sarah had anticipated this response and remained calm. She had learned early in her career that defending her conclusions required more than just confidence. It required unshakable evidence and the ability to present complex information in a way that even skeptical senior officers could understand. With respect, Admiral, the pattern becomes clear only when you analyze the data over a longer timeline and cross-reference it with economic indicators, communication intercepts, and humanitarian reports from the region, Sarah replied. The individual pieces of information appear routine when examined separately, but together they reveal a coordinated strategy that poses a significant threat to regional stability. She advanced to the next slide, which showed a timeline spanning 18 months. Red dots marked military activities, blue lines tracked economic changes, and yellow highlights showed civilian population movements. The pattern was undeniable once presented in this comprehensive format. Colonel Hartwell shook his head dismissively. This looks like standard border security measures to me. Young analysts often see patterns where none exist because they lack the experience to understand normal military operations. His comment drew nods from several other officers. Sarah felt the familiar sting of being dismissed based on her age and appearance rather than the quality of her work. But she had faced this challenge before and knew that the best response was to let the evidence speak for itself. "Colonel, I understand your skepticism," Sarah said, maintaining her professional tone. "However, this analysis has been verified by 3 independent intelligence teams, and the conclusions have been confirmed through multiple sources on the ground." She clicked to the next slide, revealing intercepted communications that had been translated and analyzed. The messages, when pieced together, told a story of coordinated planning that extended far beyond routine border security. Supply requests, personnel transfers, and equipment movements all pointed toward preparation for a significant military operation. General Morrison leaned forward, studying the information more carefully. As the committee chairman, he had seen countless briefings from analysts of all ages and experience levels. He prided himself on being able to distinguish between solid intelligence and wishful thinking, and something about Sarah's presentation was beginning to capture his attention. "These communication intercepts," he said, pointing to specific entries on the slide, "how confident are we in their authenticity and translation accuracy?" Sarah had anticipated this question as well. The intercepts have been verified through multiple channels, and the translations have been confirmed by native speakers from 3 different intelligence services. Additionally, we have corroborating evidence from human intelligence assets in the region. The room grew quieter as more officers began to focus on the details Sarah was presenting. Despite their initial skepticism, the evidence was becoming difficult to ignore. The data showed clear patterns of preparation and coordination that suggested something far more serious than routine military exercises. Captain Rodriguez, who had been silent throughout the briefing, spoke up. "Lieutenant, assuming your analysis is correct, what timeline are we looking at for potential action?" This was the question Sarah had hoped someone would ask, because it demonstrated that at least some of the assembled officers were beginning to take her findings seriously. Based on the pace of preparations and the seasonal factors that would influence military operations in that region, we estimate a window of 6 to 8 weeks for initial action. The timeline sent a ripple of concern through the room. 6 to 8 weeks was barely enough time to coordinate a response among NATO allies, let alone prepare adequate defensive measures or diplomatic interventions. If Sarah's analysis was correct, they were facing a crisis that required immediate attention and action. Colonel Hartwell, however, remained unconvinced. "This is exactly the kind of alarmist interpretation we get from inexperienced analysts," he said, his voice carrying a tone of authority that had silenced many junior officers throughout his career. "Young people today want to turn every border exercise into an international crisis." His words stung, but Sarah had learned to channel that kind of dismissal into determination. She had spent countless hours verifying every aspect of her analysis precisely because she knew her age and appearance would invite skepticism. Every conclusion in her briefing was supported by multiple sources and confirmed through rigorous analysis. As the tension in the room grew thicker, Sarah prepared to present the most crucial part of her briefing. The information she was about to share would either vindicate her analysis or end her career in intelligence. But she knew she had to present it, regardless of the personal risk. Sarah clicked to the next slide, revealing a detailed analysis of financial transactions that had been flowing through various international banking channels over the past 4 months. The numbers told a story that few people outside of intelligence circles would be able to interpret, but for the experienced military minds in the room, the implications were staggering. "The economic indicators are perhaps the most telling aspect of this entire situation," Sarah continued, pointing to specific data points on the screen. "Large-scale purchases of medical supplies, food reserves, and fuel have been made through shell companies with connections to military procurement offices. The quantities far exceed what would be needed for standard exercises or routine border security operations. Admiral Thompson studied the financial data more carefully. His experience in naval logistics had taught him to recognize the patterns of military preparation, and what Sarah was showing looked disturbingly familiar. The scale of purchasing suggested preparation for extended operations involving large numbers of personnel. These medical supply orders, he said, pointing to specific entries, they include field surgical equipment and blood products. That's not standard equipment for border exercises. Sarah nodded, pleased that someone was beginning to understand the gravity of what she had discovered. Exactly, Admiral. The medical preparations suggest planning for casualties on a scale that would only be expected in active combat operations. General Morrison made notes on his tablet as Sarah continued her presentation. His years of experience had taught him to look beyond surface appearances and focus on the substance of intelligence reports. While Sarah's youth might invite skepticism from some of his colleagues, her analysis was methodical and thorough. Colonel Hartwell, however, remained determined to challenge her conclusions. Lieutenant, you're making significant assumptions based on purchasing patterns that could have multiple explanations. Perhaps they're updating their medical infrastructure or conducting large-scale training exercises. Sarah had anticipated this objection and was prepared with additional evidence. Colonel, that would be a reasonable explanation if these purchases were happening in isolation. However, when combined with the personnel movements and communication intercepts, a different picture emerges. She advanced to a slide showing organizational charts and personnel transfers that had occurred over the past 3 months. Key military leaders have been reassigned to positions that would be crucial for coordinating large-scale operations. Communication specialists, logistics coordinators, and operational planners had all been moved to strategic locations along the border region. Captain Rodriguez, who had served in multiple combat zones, recognized the pattern immediately. This looks like the kind of personnel positioning we do before major deployments, he observed. You don't move your best coordinators and planners to border positions for routine operations. The validation from experienced field commander gave Sarah additional confidence to continue presenting her most sensitive findings. She clicked to the next slide, which showed intercepted communications between military leaders discussing operational timelines and coordination with civilian authorities. The communication intercepts revealed discussions about temporary administrative measures and population management protocols, Sarah explained. These terms are consistent with planning for occupation and control of civilian areas following military action. The room fell silent as the implications of this information sank in. Military occupation of civilian areas meant something far beyond border security or routine exercises. It suggested planning for invasion and conquest of sovereign territory, which would represent a massive escalation of international tensions. General Morrison looked up from his notes with a grave expression. Lieutenant, are you suggesting that we're looking at preparation for a full-scale invasion? Sarah took a deep breath before answering. This was the conclusion that her analysis had led to, but saying it aloud to this group of senior military leaders felt enormous. Once she voiced this assessment, there would be no going back, and the consequences would extend far beyond her own career. Based on all available evidence, sir, that appears to be the most likely explanation for the patterns we're observing, Sarah replied. The scale of preparation, the types of supplies being purchased, the personnel movements, and the communication intercepts all point toward planning for a major military operation designed to seize and hold territory. Colonel Hartwell stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His face showed a mixture of frustration and disbelief that someone so young would make such a dramatic assessment in front of the Joint Strategic Planning Committee. This is exactly the kind of reckless analysis that leads to international incidents, he said, his voice rising. You're asking us to believe that a major military power is planning an invasion based on your interpretation of routine military activities. Do you have any idea what kind of diplomatic crisis this could create if we act on unfounded intelligence? The colonel's reaction was more intense than Sarah had expected, but she understood his concern. Intelligence assessments that suggested imminent military action carried enormous responsibility. If she was wrong, diplomatic relations could be damaged unnecessarily. If she was right and they failed to act, the consequences could be catastrophic. Admiral Thompson had been studying the financial data throughout the exchange, and his expression had grown increasingly serious. His naval background had given him extensive experience with military logistics, and the purchasing patterns Sarah had identified were deeply concerning. "Colonel, I understand your skepticism," the admiral said, "but the logistics data is extremely compelling. The quantities and types of supplies being purchased are consistent with preparation for extended military operations involving tens of thousands of personnel." Sarah felt a wave of relief that someone with Admiral Thompson's experience was beginning to support her analysis. She had spent months developing these findings, and having them dismissed without careful consideration would have been devastating both professionally and personally. General Morrison had been taking detailed notes throughout the briefing, and his questions showed that he was taking Sarah's analysis seriously. "Lieutenant, what additional confirmation would you need to increase your confidence in this assessment?" This was a question Sarah had hoped someone would ask. She had already identified several ways to verify her conclusions, but she needed authorization and resources to pursue them. "Sir, we could verify the assessment through increased surveillance of the border region, analysis of additional communication channels, and coordination with intelligence services from allied nations in the area." Captain Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "That makes sense. If this level of preparation is really happening, our allies in the region should be seeing similar indicators." Colonel Hartwell remained skeptical, but his opposition was becoming less vocal as other officers began to engage seriously with Sarah's findings. The weight of evidence was becoming difficult to dismiss, even for those who were initially skeptical of her age and experience. Sarah clicked to her final slide, which showed a recommended timeline for verification activities and potential response options. She had spent weeks developing this action plan, knowing that intelligence analysis was worthless unless it led to concrete steps that could address the identified threats. The verification activities could be completed within 2 weeks, Sarah explained. If the additional intelligence confirms our current assessment, we would still have sufficient time to coordinate defensive measures and diplomatic initiatives. The room was now completely focused on the substance of Sarah's briefing rather than her age or appearance. The evidence she had presented was comprehensive and troubling, and even the most skeptical officers were beginning to recognize the potential validity of her conclusions. As Sarah concluded her presentation, she felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. She had successfully presented her findings to some of the most important military leaders in NATO, but now the real work would begin. If her analysis was correct, the next few weeks would be crucial for preventing a major international crisis. The silence that followed Sarah's presentation was deafening. 37 of NATO's most senior military leaders sat processing the implications of what they had just heard. The evidence was methodical, comprehensive, and deeply troubling. What had begun as routine skepticism toward a young analyst had transformed into serious concern about a potential international crisis. General Morrison was the first to break the silence. "Lieutenant Shun, your analysis presents a scenario that would require immediate coordination among all NATO member states. Before we proceed, I need to understand the confidence level of your assessment." Sarah had prepared for this question throughout her months of research. Intelligence analysis was never about absolute certainty. It was about providing decision-makers with the best possible understanding of complex and evolving situations. The stakes of this particular assessment, however, were higher than anything she had previously encountered. "Sir, based on the available evidence and multiple verification methods, I would assess our confidence level at approximately 85%, Sarah replied. The convergence of financial indicators, personnel movements, communication intercepts, and logistical preparations creates a pattern that is difficult to explain through any other scenario. Admiral Thompson had been reviewing his own notes during the discussion, comparing Sarah's findings with intelligence reports he had received through naval channels. His expression suggested that her analysis aligned with information he had been seeing from other sources. General Morrison, our naval intelligence has been tracking increased submarine activity in the Baltic region over the past month, the admiral said. At the time, we attributed it to routine patrol operations, but given Lieutenant Chen's timeline, the pattern takes on new significance. This corroboration from an independent source sent a wave of concern through the room. When intelligence from different agencies and sources began to align, it typically indicated that the analysis was identifying real rather than imaginary patterns. The submarine activity Admiral Thompson described fit perfectly with the preparation timeline Sarah had outlined. Colonel Hartwell, who had been the most vocal skeptic throughout the briefing, found himself in an increasingly difficult position. While his instincts told him to remain cautious about intelligence assessments that could lead to military action, the evidence was becoming overwhelming. His years of experience had taught him to recognize when initial skepticism needed to give way to operational reality. If we accept Lieutenant Chen's analysis as accurate, Colonel Hartwell said, his tone more measured than before, what are our immediate options for response? Sarah appreciated that the colonel was beginning to engage with the substance of her findings, rather than simply dismissing them. This shift in attitude reflected the professionalism that had made him a successful military leader, even when faced with information that challenged his initial assumptions. Captain Rodriguez had been studying the timeline Sarah had presented, and his combat experience gave him insight into the operational aspects of what they were discussing. The timeline presents significant challenges for coordination among NATO allies, he observed. 6 to 8 weeks isn't much time to organize a coherent response if military action becomes necessary. General Morrison nodded in agreement. The challenge of coordinating military responses among 19 different countries was enormous under the best circumstances. When facing a compressed timeline and incomplete information, the difficulties became exponentially greater. Every day spent on verification and planning was a day less available for actual preparation. Sarah had anticipated these concerns and had developed recommendations for addressing them. Sir, if I may suggest, we could begin preliminary coordination activities while the verification process continues. This would allow us to maintain diplomatic options while ensuring that military responses remain available if needed. This suggestion demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that impressed the assembled officers. Rather than simply identifying problems, Sarah was proposing solutions that balanced the need for careful verification with the reality of operational timelines. Her approach showed understanding of both intelligence analysis and military planning. Admiral Thompson was particularly interested in the naval implications of Sarah's assessment. Lieutenant, your analysis focuses primarily on land-based preparations. Have you identified any naval components to this potential operation? Sarah clicked back to an earlier slide that showed port activities and shipping movements along the coastal regions. Admiral, we've observed increased activity at several naval facilities, including unusual fuel deliveries and the movement of amphibious assault vessels. The scale suggests preparation for operations that would require significant naval support. The naval component added another layer of complexity to the situation. Amphibious operations required extensive coordination between land, sea, and air forces, suggesting that any potential military action would be far more comprehensive than a simple border incursion. This level of complexity supported Sarah's assessment that they were looking at preparation for major military operations. Colonel Hartwell was now fully engaged with the details of Sarah's analysis. These amphibious preparations, he said, they would be necessary for operations against coastal targets or islands in the region. That expands the potential scope of conflict significantly. Sarah nodded. Exactly, Colonel. The combination of land-based preparations and naval assets suggests planning for operations across multiple domains and geographic areas. This level of coordination indicates strategic rather than tactical objectives. The distinction between tactical and Strategic operations was crucial for understanding the potential scope of the threat. Tactical operations were typically limited in geography and objectives, while strategic operations aimed to achieve broader political and military goals that could affect the entire regional balance of power. General Morrison looked around the room at his colleagues. Given the complexity and potential scope of this situation, I believe we need to elevate this discussion to the highest levels of NATO command structure. Lieutenant Chin's analysis requires review by the Secretary General and the North Atlantic Council. This was exactly the outcome Sarah had hoped for. While she was confident in her analysis, the implications were too significant for any single committee to address. The involvement of NATO's highest leadership would ensure that appropriate resources were dedicated to verification and response planning. Captain Rodriguez raised another important consideration. We should also coordinate with intelligence services from countries that would be directly affected by any potential military action. Their local knowledge could provide crucial verification of Lieutenant Chin's assessment. Sarah had already identified several intelligence services that could provide valuable corroboration, but she had lacked the authority to initiate direct contact with them. With support from the Joint Strategic Planning Committee, those coordination efforts could begin immediately. Admiral Thompson was already thinking about the naval response options that might be necessary. If this assessment proves accurate, we'll need to begin positioning naval assets for both defensive and deterrent purposes. That requires significant advanced planning and coordination with allied fleets. The conversation was now focused entirely on operational planning rather than skepticism about Sarah's analysis. The evidence she had presented had been compelling enough to shift the discussion from whether her assessment was credible to what actions should be taken based on her conclusions. As the meeting began to wind down, General Morrison addressed Sarah directly. "Lieutenant, you've presented analysis that could have enormous implications for international security. Your work will be forwarded to the highest levels of NATO leadership, and you should expect to be called upon for additional briefings and verification activities." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and responsibility. Her months of careful analysis had been taken seriously by some of the most experienced military leaders in the world, but now the real work would begin. If her assessment proved accurate, the next few weeks would be among the most challenging in recent NATO history. The meeting concluded with assignments for follow-up activities and coordination efforts. Sarah packed her briefing materials knowing that her career had just taken a dramatic turn, regardless of how the situation ultimately developed. She had presented analysis that challenged conventional wisdom and forced serious consideration of scenarios that no one wanted to contemplate. 3 days after Sarah's presentation to the Joint Strategic Planning Committee, NATO headquarters buzzed with unprecedented activity. Intelligence officers from 19 member nations had converged on Brussels, working around the clock to verify her assessment. The verification process had uncovered additional evidence that made her original analysis appear conservative rather than alarmist. Sarah found herself at the center of an intelligence operation unlike anything in her career. The young analyst who had faced skeptical glances just days earlier was now briefing senior officials from multiple countries and coordinating with intelligence services across Europe and North America. The weight of responsibility was immense, but the evidence continued to support her conclusions. Commander Jake Morrison, a Navy SEAL who led NATO's Special Operations Coordination Center, had been following Sarah's analysis since the initial briefing. His background in special operations gave him a unique perspective on military preparations, and he recognized patterns in the intelligence that others might miss. Unlike the initial skeptics in the conference room, Commander Morrison had immediately understood the significance of what Sarah had discovered. The commander was known throughout NATO circles for his tactical brilliance and his ability to assess complex military situations quickly and accurately. At 35, he had led operations in multiple theaters and had developed a reputation for seeing strategic implications that others missed. His input on Sarah's analysis would carry significant weight with decision-makers at the highest levels. As Sarah prepared for another briefing session, she was surprised to learn that Commander Morrison had requested a private meeting to discuss specific aspects of her intelligence assessment. His reputation preceded him, and she felt both honored and nervous about the opportunity to present her findings to someone with his operational experience. The meeting took place in a secure conference room deep within NATO headquarters. Sarah arrived with her latest intelligence updates, including verification information that had come in from Allied intelligence services over the past 72 hours. The additional evidence had strengthened her confidence in the original assessment and had revealed aspects of the situation that were even more concerning than initially understood. Commander Morrison entered the room with the quiet confidence that marked experienced special operations leaders. His appearance was understated, but Sarah recognized the bearing of someone who had operated in high-stress situations where analytical precision could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Lieutenant Shun, the commander began, "I've reviewed your analysis in detail, and I believe you've identified something that has significant implications beyond what most people in that committee room understood." Sarah was intrigued by his comment. Her analysis had focused on conventional military preparations and the threat of large-scale invasion, but Commander Morrison's special operations background might give him insight into aspects she had not considered. "Sir, I'd be interested in your perspective on the intelligence we've gathered," Sarah replied. "Your operational experience provides a viewpoint that pure analysis sometimes misses." Commander Morrison spread several of Sarah's intelligence summaries across the conference table, focusing particularly on the personnel movements and communication intercepts. His examination was methodical and detailed, reflecting the careful analytical approach that had made him successful in complex operational planning. "Your analysis of conventional military preparations is accurate and concerning," he said, "but there are elements in this intelligence that suggest preparation for unconventional operations as well. The personnel movements include specialists whose skills are typically associated with special operations rather than conventional invasion forces." This observation opened a new dimension to Sarah's analysis. She had focused primarily on the evidence of large-scale conventional military preparation, but Commander Morrison was identifying indicators of special operations planning that could precede or accompany conventional military action. "Can you elaborate on which personnel movements suggest special operations involvement?" Sarah asked, pulling out her detailed files on military personnel transfers. Commander Morrison pointed to specific entries in Sarah's data. These transfers involve communications specialists with advanced technical training, demolitions experts, and personnel with linguistic capabilities in local languages. This combination suggests preparation for operations that would require infiltration and coordination with local assets. The implications were staggering. If Commander Morrison's assessment was correct, the military preparations Sarah had identified included planning for special operations that could begin before any conventional military action. Such operations could involve sabotage of critical infrastructure, disruption of communication systems, and coordination with local sympathizers to create chaos and confusion. Sarah realized that her analysis had only captured part of a much larger and more complex military operation. "Commander, if special operations are part of this planning, it could significantly alter our understanding of the timeline and the nature of the threat." "Exactly," Commander Morrison replied. "Special operations typically precede conventional military action by days or weeks. If your timeline for conventional preparations is accurate, special operations could begin much sooner than anyone has anticipated." This revelation demanded immediate action. Sarah's original assessment had suggested 6 to 8 weeks before conventional military action might begin, but if special operations were planned to precede conventional forces, the timeline for initial action could be much shorter. Commander Morrison studied the communication intercepts that Sarah had gathered, focusing particularly on coded language that might indicate special operations planning. His experience had taught him to recognize the subtle differences between conventional military communication and the more discrete language used for special operations coordination. "These communication patterns," he said, pointing to specific intercepts, They include terminology that's consistent with special operations planning. References to advanced preparation and infrastructure assessment could indicate reconnaissance and target identification activities. Sarah began to understand how her analysis had underestimated the complexity and immediacy of the threat they were facing. While she had correctly identified preparation for major military action, the inclusion of special operations components meant that the situation was even more dangerous than she had originally assessed. Commander, this information needs to be incorporated into the intelligence assessment immediately, Sarah said. If special operations could begin within days or weeks, our response timeline needs to be adjusted accordingly. Commander Morrison agreed completely. Lieutenant, your original analysis was groundbreaking, but this additional perspective changes everything. We need to brief the Joint Strategic Planning Committee on these findings as soon as possible. The collaboration between Sarah's analytical expertise and Commander Morrison's operational experience had revealed a threat that was more immediate and multifaceted than anyone had previously understood. The combination of conventional military preparations and special operations planning suggested a sophisticated and comprehensive approach to military action that would be difficult to counter without advance warning. As they prepared to present these updated findings, Sarah reflected on how much her situation had changed in just a few days. The young analyst who had faced skepticism and dismissal was now working directly with one of NATO's most respected special operations commanders to assess a threat that could affect the security of multiple nations. Commander Morrison's willingness to take her analysis seriously and build upon it with his own expertise demonstrated the kind of professional respect that Sarah had worked years to achieve. More importantly, their collaboration had produced intelligence insights that neither of them could have developed independently. The updated assessment they were preparing would present an even more urgent picture than Sarah's original briefing. The inclusion of special operations planning meant that military action could begin much sooner than previously anticipated, and the nature of that action would be more complex and difficult to counter than conventional invasion alone. As they finalized their presentation materials, both Sarah and Commander Morrison understood that they were about to deliver information that could fundamentally alter NATO's approach to the developing crisis. The stakes had never been higher, and the time available for diplomatic solutions was rapidly diminishing. The emergency session of the Joint Strategic Planning Committee convened at 0600 hours, with representatives from all 19 NATO member nations present either in person or through secure video links. The urgency of the situation had prompted the fastest intelligence coordination effort in recent NATO history, and the findings that Sarah and Commander Morrison were about to present would determine the alliance's response to an unprecedented threat. Sarah entered the briefing room with a confidence she had never felt before. The skepticism and dismissive attitudes that had greeted her original presentation had been replaced by serious attention and respect for her analytical capabilities. The young analyst who had been underestimated just days earlier was now recognized as the person who had first identified a threat that could reshape European security. Commander Morrison joined her at the briefing podium, his presence lending additional credibility to their updated assessment. The collaboration between a young intelligence analyst and an experienced special operations commander represented exactly the kind of cross-functional expertise that NATO needed to address complex 21st century security challenges. General Morrison opened the session with uncharacteristic urgency. Ladies and gentlemen, Lieutenant Shun and Commander Morrison have developed intelligence that requires immediate attention from the highest levels of our respective governments. The situation we discussed 3 days ago has evolved in ways that demand immediate action. Sarah began the presentation by reviewing the verification activities that had been conducted since her original briefing. Intelligence services from 7 different NATO countries had confirmed various aspects of her analysis, and the additional evidence had strengthened rather than weakened her original conclusions. The verification process has confirmed our assessment of large-scale military preparations, Sarah reported. However, Additional analysis has revealed aspects of a threat that were not apparent in our initial intelligence gathering. She clicked to a new slide showing the special operations indicators that Commander Morrison had helped her identify. The evidence of unconventional warfare preparation painted a picture of military planning that was far more sophisticated and immediate than anyone had previously understood. Commander Morrison took over the presentation to explain the special operations implications of the intelligence. His operational experience gave him credibility with the assembled military leaders that Sarah, despite her analytical excellence, could not match through analysis alone. The personnel movements and communication patterns indicate preparation for special operations that would likely precede any conventional military action, Commander Morrison explained. Based on the timeline of these preparations, we assess that special operations could begin within 2 to 3 weeks. This timeline sent shock waves through the room. 2 to 3 weeks was barely enough time for NATO to coordinate basic defensive measures, let alone implement the comprehensive response that the situation would require. The compressed timeline meant that diplomatic efforts would need to proceed alongside military preparations. Admiral Thompson had spent the past 3 days coordinating with naval intelligence services throughout NATO, and his findings supported the urgency that Sarah and Commander Morrison were presenting. Our naval intelligence has identified submarine movements and port activities that align perfectly with the timeline Commander Morrison has outlined. Colonel Hartwell, who had been the most skeptical voice in Sarah's original briefing, now found himself in the position of supporting her analysis. The evidence that had been gathered over the past 72 hours had proven her original assessment to be accurate and, if anything, conservative in its estimation of the threat. Lieutenant Shun, Colonel Hartwell said, "I owe you an apology for my initial skepticism. Your analysis has proven to be not only accurate, but prescient. The additional verification has shown that you identified a genuine threat that our more experienced analysts had missed." Sarah appreciated the colonel's acknowledgement, but her focus remained on the operational implications of their findings. "Thank you, Colonel, but our immediate priority needs to be coordinating a response that can address both the conventional and unconventional aspects of this threat." Captain Rodriguez had been working with intelligence services from countries that would be directly affected by any military action, and his findings added another layer of urgency to the situation. Our allies in the region have begun to observe activities that confirm the special operations timeline. Local intelligence services are reporting unusual reconnaissance activities and attempts to gather information about critical infrastructure. This information confirmed that special operations preparation was moving beyond planning into active reconnaissance and target assessment. Such activities typically occurred in the final weeks before operational implementation, suggesting that the timeline for action was even shorter than previously assessed. General Morrison recognized that the situation had reached a point where individual committee decisions were insufficient. Based on this intelligence, I'm recommending immediate elevation to the North Atlantic Council and direct communication with heads of government. This situation requires decisions that exceed our authority level. Commander Morrison addressed the operational aspects of NATO's response options. If special operations begin within 2 to 3 weeks, we need to implement protective measures for critical infrastructure immediately. We also need to coordinate with local security services to increase surveillance and reporting of suspicious activities. Sarah had prepared recommendations for immediate intelligence activities that could provide early warning of special operations implementation. We should establish enhanced monitoring of communication channels, increase surveillance of personnel associated with special operations planning, and coordinate with intelligence services to track any additional personnel movements. The meeting continued for 2 hours as the assembled leaders developed coordination plans and response options. The intelligence that Sarah had first presented as a young analyst facing skeptical senior officers had now become the foundation for one of NATO's most significant security responses in decades. As the session concluded, General Morrison approached Sarah personally. "Lieutenant, Your analysis may have prevented a catastrophic surprise attack on NATO territory. Your willingness to present findings that challenged conventional wisdom, even in the face of initial skepticism, demonstrates exactly the kind of analytical courage that our alliance needs. Commander Morrison added his own assessment of Sarah's contribution. Lieutenant Chin's analysis, combined with the verification efforts over the past few days, has given NATO the advance warning necessary to prepare appropriate responses. Without her initial assessment, we would have been caught completely off guard. Sarah felt a profound sense of responsibility as she realized how much her analysis had influenced NATO's understanding of the threat they were facing. The young intelligence analyst who had entered the conference room 3 days earlier facing skepticism and dismissal was now recognized as having made a crucial contribution to European security. The following weeks would test whether NATO's response, based on Sarah's intelligence assessment, would be sufficient to deter or defeat the threat she had identified. But regardless of the ultimate outcome, she had proven that expertise and analytical precision were more important than age or experience in identifying and assessing complex security threats. As NATO headquarters shifted into crisis response mode, Sarah continued her intelligence work with a new level of responsibility and recognition. The skepticism that had once greeted her presentations had been replaced by requests for her analysis and input on critical security decisions. Her career had been transformed not through political maneuvering or self-promotion, but through the simple act of conducting thorough analysis and having the courage to present findings that challenge conventional assumptions. The story of the young analyst who had been dismissed and then vindicated would become part of NATO institutional memory, serving as a reminder that critical thinking and analytical rigor could emerge from unexpected sources, and that leadership often meant having the courage to present uncomfortable truths to people who might prefer not to hear them.